There is a scene in the 200th episode of South Park where Kyle Broflovsky stands in front of a crowd and begins to deliver a speech. It is the moral of the episode. It is the moment the entire two-part arc has been building toward. Kyle opens his mouth, and what comes out is a long, unbroken tone. A bleep. Not a comedic bleep. Not a quick censorship gag designed to make the audience laugh. A sustained, deliberate wall of sound that lasts for nearly 2 minutes. Behind that wall of sound, Kyle is saying something. He is making an argument about intimidation, about the nature of fear, about what happens when a society decides that certain ideas are too dangerous to be spoken aloud. But nobody hears it. Nobody hears Jesus either. Who speaks next? Nobody hears Santa Claus. 3 consecutive monologues, erased. The episode ends, and the audience sits in silence, having watched a show about censorship get censored. The speech is gone. The argument is gone. And in its absence, the silence says more than the words ever could have. That silence is what this video is about. Not just that one moment, but the decades of silence and noise, compromise and defiance, corporate fear and creative rebellion that define the longest and strangest partnership in American television history. 2 men from Colorado who made a short film with construction paper and a borrowed camera, and the cable network that bet everything on them, and then spent the next 3 decades trying to figure out how to live with what it had created. This is Papertown. Settle in. Get comfortable. This one is going to take a while. To understand this story properly, it is necessary to understand what television looked like in the mid-1990s. Cable was still finding its footing. The broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox, dominated the landscape. Cable channels were second-tier operations, niche players catering to specific audiences that the big networks did not bother to pursue. Comedy Central was among the smallest of these small players, a channel born from the awkward merger of 2 failed comedy channels, each backed by a media giant that could not quite figure out what to do with it. The idea that a cable channel could produce original scripted content that rivaled or surpassed the broadcast networks was, in 1996, still largely theoretical. HBO had begun to explore the territory with shows like The Larry Sanders Show, but the transformation of cable into a home for prestige and culturally significant programming was years away. South Park did not just arrive in this landscape. It helped create it, and the network that gave it a home was changed forever by its arrival, in ways that neither the creators nor the executives could have predicted. The story begins, as so many stories in television do, with a piece of content that was never meant to be content at all. In 1992, Trey Parker and Matt Stone were students at the University of Colorado, and they made a short animated film called The Spirit of Christmas. It was crude in every sense of the word. The animation was constructed from actual construction paper, filmed frame by frame with an old 8mm camera. The plot, if it can be called that, involved Jesus Christ and a snowman fighting over the true meaning of Christmas. It was violent, profane, and deeply, almost aggressively silly. It premiered at a student film screening in December of that year, and for a while, that was the end of it. But then something unusual happened. In 1995, a Fox executive named Brian Graydon paid Parker and Stone to make a second version of the short as a video Christmas card he could send to friends. This second Spirit of Christmas, which featured Jesus fighting Santa Claus, while the boys from what would become South Park stood watching and swearing, was never meant for public consumption. Graydon sent it to about 100 people. Those people copied it. Those copies were copied again and again. In an era before YouTube, before social media, before the architecture of virality had been built, the tape spread through Hollywood like a rumor. People were making VHS copies and passing them around at parties. It became one of the first pieces of content to go viral, though that word did not exist yet. This is the first important detail in understanding the relationship between South Park and Comedy Central. The show did not come into existence because a network identified a market opportunity or commissioned a pilot through the normal development process. It came into existence because a piece of contraband found its way to the right desk at the right moment. Comedy Central, in 1995 and 1996, was a network searching for an identity. It had been formed in 1991 through the merger of 2 competing comedy channels. The Comedy Channel, which was backed by HBO and Time Warner, and Ha, which was backed by Viacom. The merged entity was a joint venture, owned 50-50 by these 2 media conglomerates, and it was struggling. It had some programming. It had some viewers. What it did not have have was a hit. It did not have a reason for cable subscribers to demand that their providers carry the channel. It did not have a cultural footprint. Doug Herzog was the president of Comedy Central at the time, and when he saw the Spirit of Christmas short, he understood immediately what he was looking at. Not just a funny video, but a sensibility, a voice, a creative energy that felt unlike anything else on television. Herzog later recalled saying to his colleagues, in essence, that the network needed to be in business with these guys. But Parker and Stone did not go to Comedy Central first. They went to Fox. Fox was, at that time, the home of The Simpsons, the most successful animated show in television history. Fox seemed like the natural home for an irreverent animated comedy. Parker and Stone pitched Fox a show built around their characters, and Fox was interested, up to a point. The sticking point was a character named Mr. Hanky. Mr. Hanky was a talking piece of feces, a sentient, cheerful, singing piece of feces, who served as a Christmas mascot. Fox said no. Fox said they could not build a series around a show that featured a talking piece of feces. This is, in retrospect, one of the more consequential acts of corporate squeamishness in entertainment history. Parker and Stone left Fox and shopped the show to both MTV and Comedy Central. Parker reportedly preferred Comedy Central, fearing that MTV would attempt to turn the show into something aimed at children. When the pitch reached Comedy Central, the conversation reportedly included a simple question from the creators. They said they needed to know one thing. Were the executives open to talking poo? Comedy Central, unlike Fox, said yes. This is worth sitting with for a moment. The entire trajectory of American cable television, the entire history of what Comedy Central would become, the entire arc of South Park as a cultural institution, hinges on one network saying no to a talking piece of feces, and another network saying yes. The gap between those two answers is the gap between a network that wanted to manage risk and a network that had nothing to lose. Fox had The Simpsons, had King of the Hill, had a stable of animated programming that was generating reliable revenue. Fox could afford to say no. Fox had something to protect. Comedy Central had nothing to protect. It had nothing, period. And when you have nothing, saying yes to a talking piece of feces is not a risk. It is the absence of any better option. That desperation, that institutional hunger, is what gave South Park its home. Not vision, not artistic bravery, not a corporate commitment to creative freedom. Hunger. Comedy Central was starving, and Parker and Stone were the only meal in sight. Because Comedy Central, in 1997, had almost nothing to lose. It was available in roughly 40 million homes, which was less than half of the pay television universe at the time. It was generating modest ratings. It had no flagship show. It was, in the landscape of cable television, essentially invisible. And this is the dynamic that would define the early relationship between South Park and Comedy Central. The network needed the show far more than the show needed the network. This imbalance of power, this fundamental asymmetry, would echo through every contract negotiation, every censorship battle, every corporate showdown for the next 3 decades. Parker and Stone assembled a small team and spent 3 months creating the pilot episode, titled The Pilot Episode. The title alone gives you a sense of the creative territory they were operating in. When the pilot was completed, Comedy Central did what networks do. They tested it with focus groups. The results were catastrophic. The episode tested, by some accounts, historically poorly. Women in the test audience were particularly hostile to the material. Some viewers reportedly broke down in tears. At a Comedy Central board meeting following the test screening, Parker and Stone showed up wearing custom t-shirts emblazoned with the check minus symbol, the mark of a failing grade. The network wanted a major overhaul, but because South Park was animated, and because animation takes time, a major overhaul was impractical. Parker and Stone made minor changes and essentially delivered the same show they had always intended to make. This is the behavioral read. Watch what people do, not what they say. Comedy Central said they wanted changes. Comedy Central said the show needed work. But Comedy Central also ordered 6 episodes. They could have walked away. They could have shelved the project. They could have demanded the overhaul they said they wanted. Instead, they ordered 6 episodes of a show that had made test audiences cry, and they scheduled it for August of 1997. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this Reresis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is another detail from this period that deserves attention, because it reveals the nature of the corporate structure that would govern South Park for its entire existence. Comedy Central, in 1997, was a joint venture. It was owned 50% by Viacom and 50% by Time Warner through its HBO subsidiary. This meant that Comedy Central had 2 bosses, or As Doug Herzog later observed, it effectively had no boss. Neither parent company was willing to invest the managerial energy required to closely supervise a channel that was, in the grand scheme of their respective empires, a minor asset. This created a zone of operational freedom that was, for a show like South Park, ideal. Herzog has reflected on this dynamic with candor, suggesting that if Comedy Central had been wholly owned by either Viacom or Time Warner, South Park might never have been allowed to air. The show was too dangerous, too far outside the boundaries of what a single corporate parent would have tolerated. But in the gap between two corporate parents, each assuming the other was responsible, South Park found the space to exist. This structural detail is crucial because it did not last. In 2003, Viacom purchased Time Warner's 50% stake in Comedy Central for $1.23 billion, making the network a wholly owned subsidiary of Viacom. The zone of operational freedom narrowed. The two-boss dynamic that had allowed South Park to flourish in its early years was replaced by a single chain of command that led directly to the Viacom boardroom. And as the corporate structure tightened, the censorship battles intensified. The first 6 years of South Park, the years when the show established its identity and pushed its boundaries most aggressively, coincided precisely with the period when Comedy Central's ownership structure was most permissive. This is not a coincidence. The premiere of South Park on August 13th, 1997, did not change American television overnight. It changed it over the course of about 3 months. The first episode drew a Nielsen rating of 1.3, which translated to roughly 980,000 viewers. For a cable show on a minor network, this was respectable, but the growth was immediate and exponential. By the time the 8th episode, Starvin' Marvin, aired in November, ratings had tripled. Mass viewing parties were forming on college campuses. The show was generating the kind of word-of-mouth buzz that networks spend millions of dollars trying to manufacture and almost never achieve. South Park was not just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It was a cultural event. By early 1998, the numbers were staggering. The 10th episode, Damien, earned a 6.4 rating, which was more than 10 times the average rating for a cable show in prime time. 8 of the 10 highest-rated shows on basic cable were South Park episodes. The second season premiere, Cartman's Mom Is Still a Dirty Slut, earned an 8.2 rating with 6.2 million viewers, setting a record as the highest-rated non-sports program in basic cable history. The number of cable subscribers requesting that their providers add Comedy Central to their lineup surged, and by 1998, the channel was available in over 50% of American homes. There is something almost mythological about how quickly South Park transformed Comedy Central. The network was, before South Park, one of those channels you scrolled past. It was filler. It was background noise. It existed in the same conceptual space as channels dedicated to home shopping or gardening. Channels that technically had programming, but that no one actively sought out. South Park changed that overnight. Suddenly, Comedy Central was the channel everyone was talking about. College students were organizing their schedules around new episodes. Office workers were discussing the previous night's episode at the water cooler. The merchandise, the t-shirts emblazoned with Cartman's catchphrase, the hats, the backpacks, became ubiquitous. South Park was not just a television show. It was a cultural movement, and Comedy Central was the vehicle through which that movement reached the public. The commercial impact extended beyond ratings. Advertisers who had previously ignored Comedy Central began to take notice. The demographic that South Park attracted, young men between the ages of 18 and 34, was one of the most coveted demographics in television. These were viewers who were notoriously difficult to reach through traditional advertising, who tended to avoid network television, who consumed media in fragmented and unpredictable ways. South Park delivered them in enormous numbers, concentrated in a single half-hour block every week. For advertisers selling beer, video games, fast food, and consumer electronics, Comedy Central went from irrelevant to essential. The South Park merchandise boom of the late 1990s was itself a significant revenue stream and a source of both celebration and frustration for Parker and Stone. South Park merchandise was everywhere. T-shirts with Kenny, Cartman, and the other characters appeared in malls across America. The most popular item was a t-shirt bearing the phrase, "Oh my God, they killed Kenny," a reference to the recurring gag in which the character Kenny McCormick dies in nearly every episode. Comedy Central and Viacom controlled the merchandise licensing, and while Parker and Stone received a share of the revenue, the overwhelming commercial exploitation of the characters sometimes grated on them. The merchandise reduced a complex, subversive, multi-layered creative work to a collection of catchphrases printed on cotton. It was a reminder that while Parker and Stone controlled the creative content of the show, the commercial exploitation of that content was governed by corporate decisions in which they had limited input. This tension between creative control and commercial exploitation is a thread that runs through the entire history of the relationship. Parker and Stone made the show. Comedy Central and Viacom made the money. The two activities were related, but not identical, and the interests of the people doing them were not always aligned. Parker and Stone wanted to make the best show they could. Comedy Central wanted to maximize the revenue the show generated. These goals overlapped because a good show generated more revenue than a bad one, but they did not perfectly align because the commercial exploitation of a creative work sometimes involved decisions that the creators found objectionable, or at least irrelevant to their creative objectives. Doug Herzog would later describe the impact in stark terms. South Park, he said, was the house on which Comedy Central was built. At a time when the network was only a few years old and had a fraction of the audience it needed to survive, South Park gave it a reason to exist. The show did not just put Comedy Central on the map, it drew the map. Herzog left Comedy Central in 1998, moving on to other positions within the Viacom corporate structure. But the legacy of his decision to greenlight South Park endured. Every president who followed him at Comedy Central inherited the show, inherited the relationship, and inherited the peculiar challenge of managing two creators who were simultaneously the network's greatest asset and its most persistent source of headaches. The executives who dealt with Parker and Stone over the decades changed. The corporate parent changed names and structures, but the fundamental dynamic, the push and pull between creative ambition and corporate caution, remained constant throughout. It is worth pausing to consider what South Park meant to Comedy Central in purely strategic terms. Before South Park, the network's programming consisted primarily of stand-up comedy specials, reruns of sitcoms, and original programming that generated modest ratings. After South Park, the network had a flagship brand that attracted advertisers, drove cable subscriptions, and gave the channel a cultural identity. South Park was not just a show, it was a brand anchor, a proof of concept that demonstrated Comedy Central could produce original content that mattered. Without South Park's success, it is unlikely that Comedy Central would have taken the risks that led to other culturally significant programs like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which launched in 1999, or Chappelle's Show, which premiered in 2003. South Park proved that Comedy Central could be a home for edgy, boundary-pushing content, and that proof encouraged the network to pursue other creators who shared that sensibility. And here is where the relationship begins to get complicated. Because when you are the house on which a network is built, you have leverage, enormous leverage. But the network also has something you need: distribution, infrastructure, the machinery of broadcast television that turns a creative work into a commercial product. Parker and Stone needed Comedy Central. Comedy Central needed Parker and Stone. And the question that would define the next 3 decades was simple: who needs whom more, and how much power does that imbalance confer? The leverage manifested in ways both large and small. In contract negotiations, Parker and Stone could point to the ratings, to the advertising revenue, to the merchandise sales, and demand terms that reflected their value. In creative disputes, they could threaten, implicitly or explicitly, to leave, to take their talents elsewhere, to do for another network what they had done for Comedy Central. The threat was credible because they had other options. Fox might have rejected them in 1996, but by 1998, any network in the country would have been happy to have them. The leverage was real, and it grew as the show's success continued, and as Parker and Stone's reputation expanded beyond the confines of cable television. But leverage is a two-edged sword. The more important South Park became to Comedy Central, the more the network invested in managing the relationship, in controlling the show, in ensuring that its most valuable asset did not become a liability. The notes calls became more frequent. The standards and practices reviews became more rigorous. The corporate oversight intensified as the stakes grew. Parker and Stone had more freedom than any other creators on the network, but that freedom was always bounded by the network's assessment of risk. And as the show became more valuable, the risk of any individual episode became greater, because any individual episode now had the potential to damage a franchise worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The first major test of this dynamic came not from the television show itself, but from the film that the show spawned. In 1999, Paramount Pictures, which was owned by Viacom, which also owned Comedy Central, released South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut. The film was, by any standard, extreme. It contained 399 profane words, 128 offensive gestures, and a level of sexual and violent content that pushed far beyond what the television show had established. Parker and Stone wanted an R rating. Paramount initially wanted a PG-13 film. This is the gap. The distance between what the creators wanted and what the corporation wanted was not a matter of artistic difference. It was a matter of identity. A PG-13 South Park film would have been a fundamentally different product, aimed at a fundamentally different audience, expressing a fundamentally different sensibility. But the film did not get a PG-13 rating. It did not get an R rating either, at least not at first. The Motion Picture Association of America rated it NC-17 5 times. The film was submitted to the MPAA 6 times, and 5 of those times it was given the NC-17 designation, which would have effectively killed its commercial prospects. The final screening, which resulted in the R rating, came just 2 weeks before the film's scheduled release date. The battle with the MPAA was, in a sense, a preview of every battle Parker and Stone would fight with Comedy Central. An institutional body concerned with standards and public perception attempts to constrain content that it finds excessive. The creators push back, sometimes with argument, sometimes with strategic escalation, sometimes with the sheer force of their commercial value. In this case, executive producer Scott Rudin intervened, calling Paramount executives and, in Matt Stone's words, freaking out on them. The R rating materialized the following day. The MPAA battle for the South Park film deserves closer examination because it illuminates the broader dynamics of censorship that would define the show's relationship with Comedy Central. The MPAA rating system is not a government regulation. It is a voluntary system administered by the film industry itself, designed to preempt government censorship by demonstrating that the industry could police its own content. The system works through a panel of anonymous raters who watch films and assign them designations ranging from G for general audiences to NC-17, which effectively limits a film's commercial distribution. An NC-17 rating means that many theater chains will not show the film, many newspapers will not accept advertising for it, and the commercial prospects for the film are severely diminished. The difference between an R and an NC-17 is, for a major studio release, the difference between commercial viability and commercial death. Parker and Stone understood this. They also understood that the MPAA's standards were subjective, inconsistent, and frequently absurd. The MPAA would not tell them specifically what needed to be changed to achieve an R rating. They would simply watch the film and pronounce it NC-17, leaving the creators to guess which elements were objectionable and make changes that might or might not satisfy the raters on the next submission. Parker and Stone have described the process as an elaborate game of chicken, in which they would remove one offensive element and add another, testing the raters' tolerance and probing the boundaries of acceptability. What made the situation particularly complicated was the corporate structure. Paramount Pictures was distributing the film. Paramount was owned by Viacom. Viacom also owned Comedy Central, which aired the television show. The same corporate parent that profited from South Park's weekly profanity on cable television was also seeking an R rating for a film that was, in many ways, an extension of the same creative vision. The contradiction was evident. Viacom was comfortable broadcasting South Park's content on Comedy Central, where it generated advertising revenue and ratings, but it wanted the film version of that same content to be toned down enough to receive an R rating, so it could generate maximum box office revenue. The creative vision was consistent. The corporate calculus varied depending on the distribution channel. Matt Stone was characteristically blunt about the experience. He called the MPAA a bumbling, irresponsible organization. After the film's release, MPAA President Jack Valenti said publicly that he regretted not assigning the film an NC-17 rating. The film grossed over $83 million worldwide against a budget of $21 million, received an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song for the number Blame Canada, and holds a Guinness World Record for the most profanity in an animated film. The Oscar nomination itself became a theater of rebellion. Parker and Stone attended the 72nd Academy Awards on March 26, 2000, wearing dresses. Parker wore a replica of the green Versace gown that Jennifer Lopez had famously worn. Stone wore a recreation of the pink Ralph Lauren dress that Gwyneth Paltrow had worn to the previous year's ceremony. They later admitted that they were on acid at the time. Robin Williams performed Blame Canada at the ceremony, and the song lost to Phil Collins for You Will Be in My Heart from Tarzan, a result that Parker and Stone have have referenced with varying degrees of bitterness over the years. This is the accumulation. Each individual detail, the dress, the acid, the loss to Phil Collins, the public feuds with the MPAA, might seem like an anecdote, but taken together, they form a pattern. Parker and Stone were not simply making a television show. They were conducting a sustained, deliberate, and often gleeful assault on the structures of institutional authority that govern the entertainment industry. And Comedy Central was one of those structures. The film also revealed something important about the corporate dynamics at play. Paramount Pictures distributed the film. Comedy Central aired the show. Both were owned by Viacom. The same corporate parent that profited from the television series also profited from the film. And the same corporate parent that imposed standards and practices, guidelines on the television show also navigated the MPAA rating system for the film. The Viacom corporate umbrella meant that Parker and Stone were, in a sense, always dealing with the same entity, even when the specific executives and the specific rules changed depending on the medium. The film was rated by the MPAA. The show was governed by Comedy Central's internal standards, but the money all flowed to the same place. And the corporate calculations, the risk assessments, the weighing of creative freedom against commercial viability were all being made by people who ultimately answered to the same board of directors. This corporate unity created a peculiar dynamic in which Parker and Stone were simultaneously the most valuable creative assets of a media conglomerate and the most persistent source of corporate anxiety within that same conglomerate. The success of the film also altered the power dynamic between Parker, Stone, and Comedy Central. Before the film, they were the creators of a hit television show. After the film, they were the creators of a hit television show and a commercially successful, critically acclaimed, Oscar-nominated film. Their cultural footprint had expanded beyond the confines of cable television. Their leverage had grown correspondingly, and the negotiations that followed, the contract renewals, the battles over content, the ongoing struggle for creative control, all took place in the shadow of the film's success, with both sides knowing that Parker and Stone had demonstrated the ability to succeed outside the bounds of the Comedy Central relationship. The television show itself was, from the beginning, a negotiation between creative freedom and corporate boundaries. Comedy Central maintained standards and practices, guidelines that governed what could and could not be shown or said on the network. In the early seasons, the word shit was bleeped. The word fuck was bleeped. Certain sexual references were curtailed. Nudity was restricted. Parker and Stone operated within these constraints, but they also pushed against them constantly, testing the boundaries, probing for weaknesses, exploiting ambiguities in the rules. The most dramatic early example of this dynamic came in the season 5 premiere, It Hits the Fan, which aired on June 20th, 2001. The episode was built around the premise that a network television show would broadcast an uncensored use of the word shit, and that the entire nation would tune in to watch. It was, obviously, a commentary on the very standards that governed South Park itself, and it contained the word shit, uncensored, 162 times. Here's the detail that reveals everything about the relationship between Parker, Stone, and Comedy Central. According to the DVD commentary for the episode, the creators initially wanted to use the word only a few times. Comedy Central would not allow that. A few uncensored uses of shit would have been a violation of their standards. But when Parker and Stone proposed using the word approximately 200 times, Comedy Central approved. The logic, if it can be called logic, was that using the word a few times would be transgressive, but using it 162 times was a joke about transgression, which made it acceptable. This is one of the most revealing moments in the entire history of the show's relationship with its network. It demonstrates that the rules governing content were not, in any meaningful sense, about the content itself. They were about perception. They were about the ability of the network to frame the content in a way that could be defended to advertisers, to parent groups, to the press. A few shits were a problem. 162 shits were a bit. The line between acceptable and unacceptable was not moral. It was narrative. The evolution of language standards on South Park over the years tells its own story about the changing relationship between the show and its network. In the early seasons, the restrictions were relatively tight. Common profanities were bleeped, sexual references were curtailed, and the show operated within boundaries that, while generous by network television standards, still imposed meaningful constraints. Over time, those boundaries expanded. The word shit became permissible after the "it hits the fan" precedent. Other previously restricted words followed. By the mid-2000s, the show was operating with considerably more linguistic freedom than it had enjoyed in its first decade. And then, something remarkable happened. In 2016, during the airing of an episode called Oh Geez, the word fuck appears to have made it to air unbleeped on Comedy Central. Whether this was intentional or an error has been a matter of debate. But by season 27, in 2025, fans observed that the episode Walk is Dead aired with all four-letter words left entirely unbleeped, and the question arose again. Had Comedy Central simply stopped enforcing the language standards that had governed the show for decades? The answer appears to be, essentially, yes. The standards had not been formally abandoned. They had eroded. The audience for cable television had changed. The competition from streaming platforms, where language restrictions are minimal or non-existent, had made the old broadcast standards feel anachronistic. And Comedy Central, faced with the choice between maintaining rules that no longer served any practical purpose and losing whatever competitive edge it had left, chose to let the rules go. This erosion of standards mirrors the broader erosion of Comedy Central's position in the media landscape. The network that once set the terms for South Park, that once had the power to bleep and censor and constrain, had gradually lost the authority to enforce those constraints. Not because Parker and Stone had defeated it in some dramatic confrontation, but because the ground had shifted beneath everyone's feet, and the rules that had once seemed important had simply stopped mattering. There is also the matter of the show's first season, and the brief, unhappy experiment with a traditional writer's room. When South Park was being developed, Comedy Central insisted that the show adopt a conventional production model, with a staff of writers who would contribute scripts and ideas in the manner of any other sitcom. Parker and Stone complied. Initially, they hired writers. They set up a room. And according to Phil Stark, one of those early staff writers, the process was awkward from the beginning. Parker and Stone had a specific vision for the show, a specific voice, a specific sensibility that did not lend itself to collaborative writing in the traditional sense. At the end of the first season, Parker and Stone told Comedy Central, in straightforward terms, that they did not want to work that way. They did not want a writer's room. They would write the show themselves, or with minimal assistance, and they would do it their way. Comedy Central acquiesced. The traditional writer's room was disbanded, and from that point forward, South Park was essentially the product of two people, with Parker serving as the primary writer, director, and creative force, and Stone as his collaborator, producer, and sounding board. This shift from institutional production to auteurist production is one of the most important moments in the show's history, and it happened because Parker and Stone were willing to tell their network how the show was going to be made, and the network, having seen the ratings, having understood the value of what it had, was willing to let them. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this Rearisis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the real censorship battles, the ones that would define the legacy of South Park's relationship with Comedy Central, were not about language. They were about religion. And specifically, they were about one religion and one figure within that religion, and the question of whether a cartoon on basic cable had the right to draw a picture. On July 4th, 2001, South Park aired an episode called Super Best Friends. The episode featured a team of religious figures, a parody of the Super Friends from DC Comics, including Jesus, Buddha, Moses, Joseph Smith, Krishna, Laozi, and Muhammad. Muhammad appeared on screen, with a face, with a body, with dialogue. He used fire powers. He helped the other religious figures defeat a giant Abraham Lincoln brought to life by the magician David Blaine. It was, by South Park standards, relatively unremarkable. The episode aired. It re-aired. Nobody complained. Nobody threatened anyone. Muhammad had appeared on American television, animated in construction paper, and the world continued to turn. Consider the specific details of Muhammad's appearance in Super Best Friends. He is depicted as a bearded man in traditional garb. He speaks. He uses fire powers to help defeat a giant stone, Abraham Lincoln, that has been brought to life by the cult of David Blaine. He is treated with the same mixture of irreverence and affection that the show extends to every other religious figure. Jesus is depicted as a somewhat bumbling but well-meaning hero. Buddha is depicted as sitting and meditating. Moses is depicted as a large computerized face, a reference to the Master Control program from the film Tron. Muhammad is simply one member of a team, a figure among figures, notable only for his fire powers and his membership in the group. The episode aired in the summer of 2001, just 2 months before the attacks of September 11th. The world that existed when the episode was broadcast, the world in which depicting Muhammad in an American cartoon generated no controversy whatsoever, was about to disappear. The post-September 11 landscape would be defined by heightened sensitivity to Islam, by a global conversation about the relationship between Western media and Muslim communities, and by a growing awareness fueled by real violence, that depicting Muhammad was not just taboo within Islam, but could be physically dangerous for the people who did it. Super Best Friends belongs to the pre-September 11 world. Everything that followed belongs to the post-September 11 world, and the distance between those two worlds is the distance that defines the entire Muhammad censorship saga. This is the absence. What matters about Super Best Friends is not what happened when it aired. What matters is what did not happen. There was no outcry. There were no threats. There was no corporate intervention. Muhammad appeared on screen, and the silence that followed was the silence of normalcy. That silence is important because it establishes a baseline. It proves that there was a time, not in the distant past, but within the lifespan of the show itself, when depicting Muhammad in a cartoon was simply not controversial. The controversy that would later engulf these episodes was not inevitable. It was constructed piece by piece, incident by incident, fear by fear. The baseline of normalcy is essential because it demonstrates that the taboo against depicting Muhammad in Western media is not ancient. It is not even old. It is a product of the 21st century, constructed in real time through a series of specific events, each of which raised the stakes and narrowed the boundaries of acceptable expression. When Parker and Stone drew Muhammad in 2001, they were not being brave. They were not making a statement. They were simply drawing a character, the same way they had drawn hundreds of other characters, without any awareness that this particular act of drawing would, within a few years, become one of the most dangerous things a Western artist could do. The construction began on September 30th, 2005, when the Danish newspaper Jyllands-Posten published 12 editorial cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. The cartoons were commissioned as a deliberate test of self-censorship, an attempt to determine whether European artists and publications would avoid depicting Muhammad out of respect for Islamic tradition or fear of reprisal. The answer, it turned out, was both. The cartoons were published. Protests erupted across the Muslim world. Some of those protests turned violent. People died. Embassies were attacked. And a new taboo was established, not by religious doctrine, which had always prohibited depictions of Muhammad within Islam, but by the threat of violence, which extended that prohibition to everyone, everywhere, regardless of their beliefs. Parker and Stone watched this unfold with the particular mixture of fascination and agitation that had always driven their best work. They saw a new taboo forming in real time, and their instinct, which was always their instinct, was to push directly into it. In April 2006, they produced a 2-part episode called Cartoon Wars. The episodes were a direct response to the Jyllands-Posten controversy, using the framework of a Family Guy episode that was about to air a depiction of Muhammad. Cartman wants the Family Guy episode pulled, not because he cares about religious sensitivity, but because he hates Family Guy, and sees the controversy as an opportunity to get it canceled. Kyle wants the episode to air because he believes that capitulating to threats of violence sets a dangerous precedent. The people of South Park, faced with the prospect of terrorist retaliation, bury their heads in the sand, literally. The episodes were brilliant. They were also, for Comedy Central, a nightmare, because Parker and Stone intended to show Muhammad on screen, as they had done in Super Best Friends 5 years earlier. And between 2001 and 2006, the world had changed. Or rather, the fear had changed. The Jyllands-Posten cartoons had demonstrated that depicting Muhammad could provoke real violence, and Comedy Central, which was now wholly owned by Viacom, after Viacom had purchased the remaining 50% stake from Time Warner in 2003, was not interested in being a test case for how far that violence might extend. extend. The episodes were also a remarkably sophisticated piece of meta-commentary. The plot uses Family Guy, a real show on a real competing network, as a stand-in for the broader question of what television should and should not be allowed to depict. By making the Muhammad controversy the subject of a Family Guy episode within the South Park universe, Parker and Stone created a narrative structure in which the censorship debate was happening simultaneously on multiple levels. The characters in South Park were debating whether Family Guy should show Muhammad. The creators of South Park were debating with Comedy Central about whether South Park should show Muhammad. And the audience was watching both debates unfold in real time, aware that the fictional debate on screen was a direct reflection of the real debate happening behind the scenes. Kyle's argument within the show is straightforward. If you allow threats of violence to determine what can and cannot be shown on television, you give the people making those threats veto power over all content. Today, it is Muhammad. Tomorrow, it could be anything. The principle of free expression either applies to all speech or it applies to none. There is no middle ground in which some topics are protected and others are not, because the selection of which topics are protected is itself an act of power. And the people doing the selecting are the people willing to use violence. Cartman's argument is equally straightforward and equally honest. He does not care about free speech. He does not care about Muhammad. He cares about getting Family Guy canceled, and he sees the controversy as a tool to achieve that goal. Cartman represents the opportunist, the person who does not have principled beliefs, but who exploits the principled beliefs of others to advance his own interests. He is, in Parker and Stone's framework, the person who always wins, because he is unburdened by the constraints of principle. The production of Cartoon Wars Part 2 was, by Parker and Stone's account, a protracted battle with the network. Comedy Central initially wanted the episodes postponed. Parker and Stone argued that refusing to show Muhammad was precisely the kind of capitulation the episodes were criticizing. They pointed out, with what must have been considerable frustration, that Muhammad had already appeared on the show. He was in the Super Best Friends episode. He was, in fact, visible in the show's opening credits, which had aired in every episode across dozens of countries for years. But Comedy Central held firm. When Cartoon Wars Part 2 aired on April 12th, 2006, the moment arrived when Muhammad was supposed to appear on screen. Instead, the screen went black. A title card appeared. It read, in simple white text, that Comedy Central had refused to broadcast an image of Muhammad. Parker and Stone had not placed that title card there. Comedy Central had. The network had literally inserted itself into the show, overriding the creator's vision with a corporate statement of refusal. The network issued a statement the following day. In light of recent world events, the statement read, "We feel we made the right decision." This is the plain statement. No equivocation, no nuance, no acknowledgement of the creative or philosophical questions at stake. Just a blunt assertion of corporate authority over creative content, justified by an appeal to world events that were themselves about the power of intimidation to suppress expression. Parker and Stone responded the only way they knew how. They put a statement on the South Park Studios website, noting that Comedy Central would not allow them to show Muhammad, and expressing their frustration that the same network that had censored Muhammad had, in the same episode, allowed a scene depicting Jesus defecating on President Bush and the American flag. The double standard was the point. It was always the point. The question was never whether Muhammad could be depicted. The question was whether certain groups could, through the credible threat of violence, achieve a veto over the content of American television that no other group possessed. This is the specific anchor. Consider the specific image that Comedy Central refused to broadcast. Not a hateful caricature, not a deliberately provocative insult, simply the image of a historical and religious figure, depicted in the same cartoon style as every other character on the show, standing in a room, handing a football helmet to another character. That is all. That is the image that was too dangerous to broadcast. Meanwhile, in the same episode, Jesus Christ defecates on a human being and the American flag. This image was broadcast without alteration. The juxtaposition is not subtle. It does not require reeresis. It simply requires observation. One religious figure can be depicted in any manner, however degrading. Another religious figure cannot be depicted at all, however benign. The difference between them is not theological. It is not cultural. It is the existence or non-existence of a credible threat of violence. Comedy Central will broadcast whatever it is not afraid to broadcast. It will censor whatever it is afraid to censor. The principle is not free speech. The principle is fear. And here's the deeper irony. By censoring the image, Comedy Central proved Parker and Stone's point more effectively than the uncensored image ever could have. The black title card, the corporate statement of refusal, became the most powerful argument against censorship that the episode could have contained. Parker and Stone argued that the threat of violence was being used to suppress free expression. Comedy Central, by capitulating to that threat in real time on national television, demonstrated that the argument was correct. The censorship was the message. The medium became the proof. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this Reresis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Cartoon Wars incident was, in retrospect, only the preliminary round. The main event came 4 years later. In April 2010, South Park reached its 200th episode. Parker and Stone, characteristically, decided to mark the occasion not with a celebration, but with a provocation. Episodes 200 and 201 were designed as a meta-narrative, bringing back virtually every celebrity the show had ever mocked, every controversy it had ever courted, every boundary it had ever tested. The plot centered on Tom Cruise assembling a class action lawsuit against the town of South Park, with the celebrities agreeing to drop the suit if the town could deliver Muhammad to them. The episodes were a deliberate, sustained examination of the show's own history of controversy, and at their center was the question that had defined the Cartoon Wars saga. Could South Park show Muhammad? Episode 200 aired on April 14th, 2010. The episode was designed as a grand retrospective, bringing back scores of celebrities the show had parodied over its 13-year run. Tom Cruise, Barbra Streisand, Mel Gibson, Rob Reiner, Paris Hilton, Kanye West, and dozens of others appeared, united in their desire for revenge against the town of South Park. The sheer scale of the callback was unprecedented, a creative celebration that doubled as a legal and corporate minefield, given that every celebrity depicted was a potential source of complaint. Muhammad appeared in the episode, but he was hidden inside a bear costume, invisible to the audience. The bear costume was itself a joke about censorship, a visual gag in which the lengths taken to avoid showing the character became more absurd and conspicuous than the character himself would have been. The joke worked on multiple levels. Within the story, the characters were going to extreme lengths to conceal Muhammad's appearance, reflecting the real-world taboo against depicting him. Outside the story, Parker and Stone were going to extreme lengths to comply with Comedy Central's restrictions, while simultaneously mocking those restrictions. The bear costume was both compliance and commentary, obedience and rebellion, all at once. The day after the episode aired, the website of a group called Revolution Muslim posted a warning. The warning stated that Trey Parker and Matt Stone would probably wind up like Theo Van Gogh, a Dutch filmmaker who had been murdered in 2004 after making a film critical of the treatment of women in Islam. The post included the addresses of Comedy Central's offices and Parker and Stone's production company. The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. The FBI began an investigation. This is the moment where the relationship between South Park and Comedy Central shifted permanently. It was no longer a negotiation between a creative team and a network about what could be shown on television. It was a situation in which people had been threatened with murder over the content of a cartoon, and the network had to decide how to respond. Comedy Central chose to respond with silence. When episode 201 aired on April 21st, 2010, it had been altered in ways that went far beyond anything Parker and Stone had anticipated or approved. Every reference to Muhammad's name was bleeped. But that was not all. The entire final sequence of the episode, in which Kyle, Jesus, and Santa Claus each deliver monologues about the lesson of the story, was bleeped. Nearly the entire moral of the episode was erased. The audio was replaced with a continuous tone that lasted for minutes, rendering the conclusion of the 200th episode of South Park unintelligible. Parker and Stone issued a statement. They said they had no involvement in the censorship decisions. They said that Comedy Central had added additional bleeps beyond what they had submitted. They said that Kyle's speech at the end of the episode had been about the power of intimidation and fear, and that it had been delivered without irony. It was not a joke. It was a genuine argument about the nature of free expression, and it had been silenced. The statement from Comedy Central was brief. The company said it had made the decision based on concerns for public safety and the safety of the creators. Think about that for a moment. Sit with it. Let the full weight of what happened settle in. A network censored the content of its own show, its most valuable creative property. The show that Doug Herzog had called the house on which Comedy Central was built, because it was afraid that airing the content might get the show's creators killed. The network was not protecting public morality. It was not enforcing consistent standards. It was not making an aesthetic judgment about the quality of the content. It was making a safety calculation. It was determining that the risk of violence was sufficiently high and the potential consequences sufficiently severe that the content could not be broadcast. This is a fundamentally different kind of censorship from anything the show had previously experienced. Previous censorship had been about propriety, about decency, about what was and was not appropriate for broadcast television. This censorship was about physical safety. It was about the possibility that people would be hurt or killed because of what a cartoon depicted, and the creators, who were the ones whose lives were being threatened, wanted the content to air. The people who stood to lose the most, who were living with security details and FBI protection, wanted to say what they had to say. And the corporation that employed them, that profited from their work, that existed in its current form, largely because of their talent, said no. This is the reframe. The standard narrative about the Muhammad censorship is that it was about religion, about free speech, about the limits of satire, but it was also, fundamentally, about the nature of the corporate relationship. It was about who owns a creative work and who gets to decide what that work says. Parker and Stone created the content. Comedy Central controlled the distribution, and when those two interests collided, distribution won. Episodes 200 and 201 were pulled from rotation. They have never been re-aired on Comedy Central. They have never appeared on any streaming platform. When HBO Max acquired the streaming rights to South Park in 2020, these episodes were excluded. When Paramount Plus became the show's streaming home, they remained excluded. Super Best Friends, which had aired without incident in 2001, was retroactively pulled as well. Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2 were also removed. 5 episodes of South Park, spanning 9 years of production, have been effectively erased from the show's official catalog. The uncensored version of episode 201 has never been officially released. It exists only in fragments, in leaked clips, in the memories of the people who worked on it. The speech that Kyle delivers at the end, the one about intimidation and fear, the one that Comedy Central buried under a wall of bleeps, remains one of the most significant pieces of lost media in American television. There are communities online dedicated to reconstructing the speech, to piecing together what Kyle said from production notes, from interviews, from the few seconds of audio that leaked before being suppressed. The very existence of these communities is itself a commentary on the censorship. When you tell people they cannot hear something, the desire to hear it intensifies. The bleeps did not destroy the speech. They immortalized it. They turned a 2-minute monologue that might have been forgotten within a week into a permanent mystery, a cultural artifact whose significance grows with each passing year precisely because it remains hidden. The 2 members of Revolution Muslim who posted the threats against Parker and Stone were eventually prosecuted. Jesse Curtis Morton was sentenced to 11.5 years in federal prison in 2012 for using the internet to solicit murder. Zachary Adam Chesser was sentenced to 25 years for providing material support to a terrorist organization. The threats were not protected speech. They were crimes, and the people who made them were punished. But the censorship those threats provoked remains in place, long after the threat itself was neutralized. The people who issued the threats are in prison. The episodes they threatened violence over are still banned. The threat achieved its objective permanently, and the imprisonment of the people who made it did nothing to reverse the capitulation, and the silence continues. 16 years have passed. The world has changed in countless ways since April 2010. The people who issued the threats have been convicted and imprisoned. The political landscape has shifted multiple times. The entertainment industry has been transformed by streaming, by social media, by the complete reconfiguration of how content is produced and distributed. But the episodes remain banned. They are not coming back. Nobody at Paramount, nobody at Comedy Central, nobody at any corporate entity associated with the show has expressed any intention of restoring them. The decision made in April 2010, under duress, in the shadow of death threats, has become permanent. A temporary act of corporate self-preservation has calcified into a permanent act of corporate censorship. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this reurisis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the Muhammad episodes were not the only occasions when external pressure forced Comedy Central to intervene in South Park's content. There was also the matter of Scientology. On November 16, 2005, South Park aired Trapped in the Closet, the 12th episode of Season 9. The episode depicts Stan Marsh joining the Church of Scientology and being identified as the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard after his Thetan levels test extraordinarily high. The episode explains the core beliefs of Scientology, including the story of Xenu, with a disclaimer on screen reading, in simple text, this is what Scientologists actually believe. Tom Cruise appears as a character who literally refuses to come out of Stan's closet, a sustained double entendre that operates on approximately 0 levels of subtlety. The episode aired. It was a critical and commercial success. It won a Peabody Award. And then, when a rebroadcast was scheduled for March 15, 2006, it was pulled from the schedule and replaced with a different episode. The official explanation from Comedy Central was that the schedule change was a tribute to Isaac Hayes, who had announced his departure from the show 2 days earlier. Hayes, who voiced the character Chef and was himself a Scientologist, had issued a statement criticizing Parker and Stone for their treatment of religion. But the timing and circumstances suggested a different explanation. Reports circulated that Tom Cruise, whose next film, Mission Impossible 3, was being distributed by Paramount Pictures, a sister company of Comedy Central under the Viacom umbrella, had threatened to withdraw from promotional duties for the film if the Scientology episode continued to air. Cruise's representatives denied this. Paramount denied this. Comedy Central denied this. But the episode was pulled, and the denial came after the action, not before it. This is where the corporate structure becomes critical to understanding what happened. Comedy Central and Paramount Pictures were both owned by Viacom. Tom Cruise was one of Paramount Pictures' most valuable stars. His films generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Mission Impossible 3 had a budget of approximately $150 million. The potential commercial damage of Cruise withdrawing from promotional appearances for that film dwarfed the revenue generated by a single rebroadcast of a single South Park episode. If the choice was between Cruise and Parker and Stone, the corporate math was straightforward. Parker and Stone responded with characteristic directness. They issued a statement attributed to themselves that read in part, "So Scientology, you may have won this battle, but the war is not over." They acknowledged that someone, they did not say who, had applied pressure to suppress the episode, and they promised to continue their work. The deeper story of Isaac Hayes' departure is itself revealing and deserves careful examination. Hayes had been with the show since the beginning, voicing the character of Chef since the first season. For nearly a decade, he had lent his distinctive baritone to a character who was, among other things, sexually explicit, frequently inappropriate, and surrounded by content that mocked every religion, every institution, every sacred cow that American culture had to offer. Hayes had voiced Chef through episodes that satirized Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and dozens of other targets. He had never, in nearly 10 years, expressed public discomfort with the show's approach to religion. Then, the Scientology episode aired, and Hayes, who was himself a Scientologist, issued a statement criticizing Parker and Stone for their insensitivity toward religion. The timing was conspicuous. The specificity was conspicuous. Hayes had not objected when the show mocked Christianity. He had not objected when it mocked Judaism. He had not objected when it mocked Mormonism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or any other belief system. He objected only when the show mocked his religion. Parker and Stone pointed this out publicly, with their characteristic bluntness. But the story grew more complex over the years. In 2025, Hayes' son, Isaac Hayes III, stated publicly that his father had not voluntarily quit the show. He said that members of the Church of Scientology had acted on his father's behalf, issuing the resignation statement while Hayes was recovering from a stroke. Hayes had suffered the stroke in January 2006, just weeks before the resignation was announced. If this account is accurate, and there is no reason to doubt the testimony of Hayes' own son, then the departure of Isaac Hayes from South Park was not a principled stand by a religious believer. It was an institutional action by a religious organization, leveraging a man's medical vulnerability to punish a television show for its satirical content. Hayes did not leave South Park. He was removed from it, by people who used his name without his informed consent while he was physically incapacitated. The implications of this are profound. It means that the Church of Scientology, an organization with significant legal and financial resources, reached into the production of a Comedy Central television show and extracted one of its cast members, not through negotiation with the network or the creators, but through direct action against the performer himself. Comedy Central did not resist this. It could not have resisted this, because the action was taken outside the network's sphere of influence. But the result was the same. An external institution altered the composition of South Park's cast, and therefore the content of the show itself, through the exercise of power that had nothing to do with broadcast standards, contract law, or creative disagreement. Parker and Stone responded to the Scientology saga in the most Parker and Stone way possible. They opened the next season with an episode called The Return of Chef, in which the character of Chef returns to South Park, but has been brainwashed by a group called the Super Adventure Club, a thinly veiled stand-in for Scientology. Chef's dialogue in the episode consists entirely of audio clips from previous episodes, stitched together to form new sentences, because Hayes was no longer available to record new dialogue. The episode ends with Chef dying in graphic, prolonged, spectacularly violent fashion, falling off a bridge, being struck by lightning, mauled by a mountain lion, and impaled on a branch. The death was so excessive, so deliberately over the top, that it could only be read as a message. Parker and Stone were not mourning the loss of Chef. They were demonstrating, with characteristic excess, that they would not be intimidated by the forces that had taken him away. The Scientology episode eventually returned to the Comedy Central schedule. It re-aired. It remains available on streaming platforms. But the incident revealed the fault lines in the relationship between South Park and its corporate parent. When a powerful external force, whether a religious organization, a movie star, or a terrorist group, applied sufficient pressure, Comedy Central would bend. The question was always how much pressure was required, and how much bending the network could do before it broke. There was also the matter of the Catholic Church. On December 7th, 2005, the eve of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, South Park aired Bloody Mary, the final episode of Season 9. The episode features a statue of the Virgin Mary that appears to bleed from its posterior, and Randy Marsh, who has been diagnosed as an alcoholic, believes the bleeding statue can cure him. The Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights, under the leadership of its president Bill Donahue, condemned the episode and demanded that it be permanently retired and excluded from the DVD release. Donahue also demanded that Joseph Califano, a board member of Viacom and a practicing Catholic, issue a personal statement. When Comedy Central re-aired all of Season 9 on December 28, 2005, Bloody Mary was absent. The network said the episode had not been retired, and it eventually returned to the schedule on August 2nd, 2006. But the temporary removal demonstrated the same pattern. External pressure, corporate response, temporary suppression. The content survives, but the precedent is established. There is a pattern here that deserves closer examination. In the Scientology case, the pressure came from a movie star and a religious organization, channeled through the Viacom corporate structure. In the Catholic League case, the pressure came from an organized advocacy group with political connections and media access. In the Muhammad cases, the pressure came from the threat of physical violence. Each source of pressure was different. Each mechanism of influence was different, but the corporate response was the same. Suppress the content, manage the risk, protect the brand. And the content creators, Parker and Stone, responded to each incident in the same way too. They protested publicly. They incorporated the controversy into the show itself. They used their platform to critique the very institution that controlled their platform. And then they moved on to the next episode, the next controversy, the next battle, in the endless war between what they wanted to say and what the network was willing to let them say. This cycle of provocation, suppression, protest, and continuation is the heartbeat of the South Park and Comedy Central relationship. It is rhythmic, predictable, and, in its own strange way, productive. Each cycle generates attention, which generates viewership, which generates revenue, which gives Parker and Stone more leverage in the next negotiation, which gives them more freedom to provoke, which starts the cycle again. The relationship is not static. It is dynamic, self-reinforcing, and fundamentally generative. The conflicts are not bugs in the system. They are features. They are the mechanism through which the show renews itself, season after season, decade after decade. Consider the economics of controversy. Every time South Park generates a headline, whether from a censorship battle, a celebrity complaint, or a corporate dispute, the show benefits. The controversy drives viewership. The viewership drives advertising revenue. The advertising revenue increases the show's commercial value. The increased commercial value gives Parker and Stone more leverage in contract negotiations. The increased leverage gives them more freedom to create controversy. It is a virtuous circle, at least from the creator's perspective, in which the very forces that constrain the show also fuel its continued success. Comedy Central has understood this dynamic for decades. The network does not suppress South Park because it wants to destroy the show. It suppresses South Park because it wants to manage the show, to control the timing and magnitude of controversy, to ensure that the provocations remain within the range that is commercially productive rather than commercially destructive. The censorship is not an act of corporate hostility. It is an act of corporate management. Comedy Central is not trying to silence Parker and Stone. It is trying to calibrate the volume. And this calibration has, over the decades, become increasingly sophisticated. In the early years, the network's approach to managing South Park was blunt. Standards and practices, guidelines were applied mechanically, with specific words bleeped and specific images censored according to fixed rules. Over time, the approach evolved. The network learned which battles were worth fighting and which were not. It learned that certain controversies would blow over quickly, while others would escalate into genuine crises. It learned that Parker and Stone would push back against every restriction, and that the pushback itself could become a story. The relationship became, over the years, more nuanced, more complex, and more mutually understanding, even as the fundamental tension between creative freedom and corporate control remained unchanged. This evolution mirrors the evolution of the show itself. Early South Park was shock comedy, built on profanity, violence, and deliberately offensive humor. Later, South Park became more sophisticated, more political, more willing to engage with complex ideas and sustained narratives. The network's management of the show evolved alongside the show's own creative evolution. Both parties grew up together, and the relationship matured, even if it never became comfortable. The pattern, across all of these incidents, is consistent. Parker and Stone create content that offends a powerful constituency. That constituency applies pressure, either directly to Comedy Central, or through the larger Viacom corporate structure, or through the threat of violence. Comedy Central responds by restricting the content, either temporarily or permanently. Parker and Stone protest, sometimes publicly, sometimes through the show itself. The content may or may not return, and the cycle begins again. This is the accumulation again. One incident is an anecdote, two is a coincidence, but the Muhammad episodes, the Scientology episode, the Catholic League episode, the MPAA battles, taken together, they form a body of evidence. They demonstrate that the creative freedom South Park enjoyed was always conditional. It was freedom granted by a corporation, and what a corporation grants, a corporation can revoke. And it is important to understand the asymmetry of this conditional freedom. South Park could mock Christians, and Comedy Central would air it. South Park could mock Jews, and Comedy Central would air it. South Park could mock Mormons, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, agnostics, and practitioners of every other belief system on the planet, and Comedy Central would air it. South Park could depict Jesus defecating on a human being and the American flag, and Comedy Central would air it. But South Park could not draw a simple image of Muhammad, and Comedy Central would not air it. The freedom was conditional, and the condition was fear. Not moral objection, not principled disagreement, not a consistent standard applied equally across all content. Fear. The network was afraid of one specific response from one specific group, and that fear overrode every other consideration. This is the most damning aspect of the censorship. It was not principled. A principled network might have said that it would not broadcast content that deliberately disrespected any religious figure. That would have been a defensible position, even if Parker and Stone disagreed with it. But Comedy Central did not take that position. It took the position that it would broadcast content disrespecting every religious figure except one. The exception was not based on respect. It was based on the calculation that mocking some religions was commercially safe and mocking one particular religion was physically dangerous. The network was not protecting religious sensibility. It was protecting itself. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this Rearisis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the relationship between South Park and Comedy Central is not only a story of censorship. It is also, and perhaps more fundamentally, a story of money. And the money story begins with a single clause in a contract signed in 1997. When Parker and Stone signed their original deal with Comedy Central, their lawyer, Kevin Morris, inserted a provision that, at the time, seemed meaningless. The clause stipulated that Parker and Stone would receive 50% of any revenue generated by South Park that did not come from the show's broadcast on the cable channel. In 1997, this clause was functionally worthless. Non-broadcast revenue in 1997 meant nothing. There was no streaming. There was no digital distribution. There was no internet ecosystem capable of monetizing television content outside of the traditional broadcast window. The clause covered revenue from a market that did not exist. Kevin Morris knew Parker and Stone before they were famous. He met them at a party during the 1994 Sundance Film Festival and represented them for several years, during which, as Stone later told the New York Times, Morris did not make $1 off them. But Morris was thinking ahead. He was thinking about a future in which television content might be distributed through channels that did not yet exist, and he wanted his clients to own a piece of that future. Morris's foresight was not based on any specific prediction about the future of digital media. He did not know that streaming would exist. He did not know that YouTube would launch in 2005, or that Netflix would begin streaming in 2007, or that the entire television industry would be upended by the shift from broadcast to digital distribution. What he understood intuitively was that the entertainment industry was changing, and that the changes would create new revenue streams that did not yet exist. By securing his clients' participation in those future revenue streams, whatever they turned out to be, he was making a bet on uncertainty itself. And it was, in retrospect, the most valuable bet in the history of entertainment law. The clause also reflected something important about the power dynamic in 1997. Comedy Central had no reason to resist the clause because it seemed meaningless. Why would a network fight over revenue from distribution channels that did not exist? The digital rights to a television show in 1997 were worth nothing. They were a theoretical concept, an abstraction that generated zero revenue and demanded zero attention. Comedy Central gave them away because they had no value. And this is the irony that defines the financial relationship between South Park and its network. The most valuable part of the deal, the part that would ultimately generate billions of dollars, was the part that nobody cared about at the time it was negotiated. For 10 years, the clause sat in the contract, inert. Non-broadcast revenue remained negligible. South Park aired on Comedy Central, generated advertising revenue, sold merchandise, and the traditional economics of cable television applied. But then the internet grew, and kept growing. And suddenly, the clause that had been meaningless became the most valuable provision in the history of television contracts. In 2007, Parker and Stone, again with Morris's guidance, renegotiated their deal with Comedy Central. The new contract was a 3-year extension that included something unprecedented, a 50-50 joint venture between Parker, Stone, and Comedy Central on all revenue not related to television broadcast. This joint venture resulted in the creation of South Park Digital Studios, which would manage the show's presence online, on mobile platforms, and in video games. The significance of this joint venture cannot be overstated. In 2007, the conventional wisdom in the entertainment industry was that digital distribution was a threat. Studios and networks viewed the internet primarily as a piracy vector, a technology that enabled consumers to steal content without paying for it. The response from most media companies was defensive. They tried to shut down file-sharing networks, sued individual downloaders, and lobbied for stronger copyright enforcement. Parker and Stone, guided by Morris, took a fundamentally different approach. Instead of fighting the internet, they embraced it. Instead of trying to prevent people from accessing South Park online, they decided to give it to them. In March 2008, South Park Digital Studios launched a redesigned version of the South Park Studios website. The site offered something that was, at the time, genuinely revolutionary. Every episode of South Park, all 12 seasons, available to stream for free, legally, with advertising support. In its first week, the site received over 3 million page views, over 2 million video plays, and more than 1 million full episode streams. It was one of the earliest and most successful experiments in ad-supported free streaming, and it was made possible by the 1997 contract clause that had given Parker and Stone ownership of the digital rights that Comedy Central had not thought to value. This is the specific anchor. The details matter here. The clause was inserted in 1997. The website launched in 2008. 11 years passed between the planting of the seed and the harvest. During those 11 years, the entire media landscape transformed, and the clause that had seemed like a throwaway provision became the foundation of a business worth billions of dollars. Kevin Morris, the lawyer who had worked for free, who had insisted on that clause when nobody, including his own clients, understood what it would be worth, had executed what may be the single most prescient legal strategy in the history of entertainment law. The launch of South Park Studios was also a statement about the relationship between Parker, Stone, and Comedy Central. By creating a direct-to-consumer digital platform, Parker and Stone were establishing an alternative distribution channel that existed alongside, and in some tension with, the traditional broadcast channel. Viewers could now choose. They could watch South Park on Comedy Central, with commercials on Comedy Central's schedule, subject to Comedy Central's editorial decisions about which episodes to air and which to withhold. Or they could watch it on South Park Studios, on their own schedule, on demand. The digital platform did not replace the broadcast platform, but it diminished its exclusivity. And in diminishing its exclusivity, it subtly shifted the power dynamic. The South Park Studios website also demonstrated something important about the relationship between Parker, Stone, and their audience. The show had always been heavily pirated. Episodes were available on file-sharing networks within hours of broadcast. Rather than fighting piracy through legal threats and digital rights management, as most media companies were doing at the time, Parker and Stone chose to compete with piracy by offering a legal alternative that was free. The strategy worked. When you give people a legitimate way to access content without paying for it, most people will choose the legitimate option. The piracy rate for South Park declined. The advertising revenue from the website grew, and Parker and Stone, thanks to their 50-50 split, captured half of every dollar. The financial relationship between South Park and its corporate partners would only grow more complex and more lucrative as the streaming era began in earnest. During the years between 2008 and 2019, the show navigated what was, in many ways, the most stable phase of the South Park and Comedy Central relationship. The show continued to air on Comedy Central, continued to push boundaries, continued to generate controversy, and continued to perform commercially. The relationship between the creators and the network settled into a pattern that was, if not exactly comfortable, at least predictable. Parker and Stone made the show. Comedy Central aired the show. Disagreements arose, were negotiated, and were resolved. The 6-day production cycle continued without interruption, season after season, year after year. During this period, the show also evolved creatively in ways that affected the relationship with the network. Beginning around season 18 in 2014, South Park moved away from standalone episodes towards serialized storytelling, with season-long arcs that built on each other from week to week. This was partly a creative decision, an attempt to deepen the show's storytelling and create more complex narratives. But it also had practical implications for the relationship with Comedy Central. Serialized storytelling made individual episodes harder to censor or pull because each episode depended on the episodes before and after it. If Comedy Central pulled a single episode from a serialized season, the entire narrative arc would be disrupted. This structural change, whether intentional or not, gave Parker and Stone additional protection against network interference. The serialized seasons also demonstrated the show's continued relevance in a rapidly changing media landscape. By engaging with current events in real time, week by week, building narratives that evolved alongside the news cycle, South Park maintained a level of cultural significance that few long-running shows can sustain. The 2016 season, which tracked the presidential election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, was one of the most discussed television events of the year, generating conversation and controversy that extended far beyond the show's traditional audience. Comedy Central benefited enormously from this cultural relevance, which drove ratings and advertising revenue, even as the overall cable television market continued to decline. In October 2019, Warner Media announced that it had acquired the exclusive streaming rights to the South Park library for its forthcoming upcoming platform, HBO Max. The deal was valued at approximately $500 million, making it one of the largest streaming acquisitions for a single television series. Under the terms of the agreement, HBO Max would have exclusive rights to stream all existing seasons of South Park, plus 3 additional seasons that had not yet been produced. Each of those future seasons was expected to consist of 10 episodes. The HBO Max deal represented a new phase in the South Park business model. For the first time, the show's library was being licensed to a platform that was not affiliated with Comedy Central or Viacom. HBO Max was owned by Warner Media, which was itself owned by AT&T. The deal was, in essence, a competitor paying $500 million for the right to stream content that Comedy Central had created and broadcast. And because of the 1997 clause and the subsequent joint venture agreement, Parker and Stone were entitled to a substantial share of that revenue. South Park began streaming on HBO Max on June 24th, 2020. 4 months later, the world was in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic, and South Park responded with what would become one of its most commercially and creatively significant moves. On September 30th, 2020, South Park aired the pandemic special on Comedy Central. The episode was simulcast on MTV and MTV2, drawing a combined audience of over 4 million viewers, the highest rated South Park episode since 2014. It was also made available on HBO Max 24 hours after its premiere, marking the first time a new South Park episode had appeared on the streaming platform. The pandemic special was followed by additional specials, including the South Park Q vaccination special, which aired in March 2021. These pandemic specials were significant not just as creative works, but as business strategy. They demonstrated that South Park could generate massive viewership events, that the brand remained commercially viable, and that the show's audience was willing to engage with long-form, special event content in addition to the regular weekly episodes. This demonstration of value set the stage for what would become one of the richest deals in television history. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this Reirisis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. In August 2021, MTV Entertainment Studios announced a new deal with Trey Parker and Matt Stone. The deal was valued at more than $900 million. It extended South Park on Comedy Central through season 30, which would carry the show to at least 2027. It also called for 14 original films, or extended specials, to be produced for Paramount Plus, the streaming platform that had been relaunched from CBS All Access earlier that year. $900 million. For a show made with construction paper. For a show that a test audience had made cry. For a show that Fox had rejected because of a talking piece of feces. The gap between the show's humble origins and its current commercial value is so vast that it defies normal comprehension. And every dollar of that $900 million flows, in one form or another, through the relationship between Parker, Stone, and the corporate entity that distributes their work. The deal was structured to benefit Paramount's streaming ambitions. The 14 Paramount Plus projects were designed to drive subscriptions to the platform, using the South Park brand as a draw. The first of these projects, South Park Post-COVID, premiered on Paramount Plus in November 2021. The second, South Park Post-COVID, The Return of COVID, followed in December. Additional specials, including South Park, The Streaming Wars, and its sequel, were released in 2022. But the deal also created a problem, because South Park now had obligations to 2 competing streaming platforms. The library was on HBO Max under the 2019 deal. The new specials were on Paramount Plus under the 2021 deal. And the question of what constituted a regular episode versus a special, and which platform had rights to what, became a matter of considerable legal dispute. In February 2023, Warner Bros. Discovery, which now owned HBO Max following its merger with Warner Media, filed a lawsuit against Paramount. The suit alleged that Paramount and South Park Digital Studios had conspired to divert content that should have gone to HBO Max to Paramount Plus instead. Specifically, WBD argued that the pandemic specials and subsequent Paramount Plus specials were, in substance, episodes of South Park that should have been covered by the HBO Max licensing agreement. WBD had agreed to pay approximately $1.69 million per episode, and it alleged that it had received far fewer episodes than it had been promised. The numbers tell the story. WBD expected 30 new episodes over 3 seasons, at 10 episodes per season. What it got was considerably less. Season 24 consisted of 2 episodes, the pandemic specials. Seasons 25 and 26 produced additional episodes, but fell short of the expected 30. Meanwhile, Paramount Plus was receiving a steady stream of South Park specials that, from WBD's perspective, looked a lot like the episodes it had paid for. Paramount filed a counterclaim, alleging that WBD owed $52 million in unpaid licensing fees for episodes that had been delivered and were streaming on HBO Max. The legal battle continued through 2023 and into 2024, with a New York court ruling that Paramount may have actively convinced the South Park joint venture to breach its contract with WBD. This legal battle placed the show at the center of one of the most significant disputes in the streaming era. 2 of the largest media companies in the world were suing each other over the right to stream a cartoon about 4 foul-mouthed children in a small Colorado town. The amounts at stake, hundreds of millions of dollars, reflected not just the commercial value of South Park, but the strategic importance of content in the streaming wars. This is the behavioral read applied to corporate entities. Watch what the companies did, not what they said. Paramount said it was honoring its agreements, but Paramount also structured its deals with Parker and Stone in a way that maximized the value flowing to Paramount Plus while minimizing the content available to HBO Max. Parker and Stone, for their part, were happy to direct their creative energy toward the platform that was paying them $900 million, rather than the platform that had paid $500 million for library rights. The streaming wars surrounding South Park were, in microcosm, the streaming wars of the entire entertainment industry. Multiple platforms competing for the same content, exclusive licensing deals creating artificial scarcity, legal disputes over the definitions of terms that had seemed clear when the contracts were signed, but became ambiguous when the business models changed. And at the center of it all, 2 men from Colorado who had been making the same show for over 25 years, and who had, through a combination of talent, stubbornness, and one very well-drafted contract clause, positioned themselves to profit enormously from every phase of the industry's evolution. Parker and Stone were not passive beneficiaries of these corporate maneuvers. They were, through their production company, Park County, and the South Park Digital Studios joint venture, active participants in the negotiations. And they demonstrated, repeatedly, that they understood their leverage and were willing to use it. The 2022 Paramount Plus specials are particularly revealing in this regard. South Park, The Streaming Wars, released on June 1st, 2022, was a special produced for and distributed by Paramount Plus. It was also, transparently, a satire of Paramount Plus itself. The character Pie Pie, a recurring figure in the South Park universe, operates a water park called Pie Pee's Splashtown, and the special uses Pie Pie as a thinly veiled stand-in for Paramount Plus and its corporate parent. The streaming platform is parodied as a cheap, urine-soaked operation that exists primarily to extract money from consumers who have already paid for other, better services. Parker and Stone made a special for Paramount Plus that mocked Paramount Plus. They took money from the platform and used that money to make content that ridiculed the platform. And Paramount distributed it anyway, because what choice did they have? The South Park brand was too valuable to suppress. The audience was too large to alienate. And the contract guaranteed that the content would be delivered regardless of whether the corporate parent approved of its message. This is the reframe. The standard narrative about the streaming wars is that it was a satire of the entertainment industry. And it was. But it was also an act of corporate defiance disguised as product. Parker and Stone were telling their employer, to its face, in a product that their employer was paying for and distributing, that they thought their employer was a joke, and their employer smiled and cashed the checks, because the alternative was losing South Park entirely. The Paramount Plus specials also represented a genuine creative evolution for the show. The extended runtime, typically around 50 minutes rather than the standard 22, allowed Parker and Stone to tell more complex stories, to develop characters more fully, to explore themes with a depth and patience that the weekly format did not always permit. Post-COVID, imagine the South Park characters as adults, projected decades into the future, dealing with the long-term consequences of the pandemic and their own life choices. It was surprisingly emotional, surprisingly reflective, and surprisingly mature for a show that had built its reputation on juvenile humor and deliberate provocation. The specials also demonstrated something about the relationship between format and freedom. On Comedy Central, South Park was constrained by the 22-minute format, by the commercial breaks, by the expectations of a weekly audience that expected a certain type of episode. On Paramount Plus, those constraints were relaxed. The runtime was flexible. There were no commercial breaks. The audience was self-selecting, choosing to seek out the specials rather than encountering them as part of a broadcast schedule. This shift in format and distribution created new creative possibilities, and Parker and Stone used them. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this reresis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The most recent chapter in the South Park and Comedy Central saga played out in 2025, and it was, by any measure, the most contentious yet. The 2021 deal, which had been valued at $900 million, was set to govern the relationship through 2027. But as the Skydance Media acquisition of Paramount Global moved toward completion, the landscape shifted again. Parker and Stone, through Park County, entered into negotiations for a new deal. The initial framework, according to reports, was a 10-year agreement worth $3 billion. $3 billion for a television show. The number reflects not just the commercial value of South Park, but the strategic importance of the brand to Paramount's streaming ambitions. In a media landscape where every platform was fighting for subscribers, South Park was one of the few properties that could reliably drive acquisition and retention. But the negotiations did not go smoothly. Jeff Shell, who was set to become president of Paramount Global under the Skydance deal, reportedly pushed back against the length and cost of the proposed agreement. Skydance was reluctant to commit to a 10-year deal, concerned about how the streaming market might evolve over that period. Parker and Stone accused Shell of interfering in their negotiations, not just with Paramount, but with competing platforms. Reports indicated that Parker and Stone had been in discussions with both Netflix and Warner Bros. Discovery about potential deals, and that Shell had taken steps to complicate those discussions. The situation escalated in ways that revealed just how much the power dynamic had shifted since 1997. Parker and Stone were no longer two young creators grateful for a chance to air their show. They were two billionaires, backed by a production company worth over $1 billion, with offers on the table from multiple competing platforms. They did not need Paramount. Paramount needed them, and when the negotiations stalled, they responded not with frustration or resignation, but with preparation for war. Park County enlisted Brian Friedman and Stuart Liner, attorneys known for aggressive litigation, to prepare a potential lawsuit against Paramount and Skydance. The involvement of Friedman, in particular, signaled that the dispute had moved beyond normal Hollywood negotiating posture into genuinely hostile territory. Friedman had built a reputation as a litigator who did not bluff. The negotiations continued through the spring and early summer of 2025, with the premiere of season 27 hanging in the balance. The season had been originally scheduled for July 9th, but was delayed by 2 weeks as the deal remained unresolved. The prospect of South Park leaving Comedy Central, of the show that had built the network finding a new home on a competing platform, was, for the first time in the show's history, a real possibility. The deal was finalized on July 21st, 2025, just 2 days before the season 27 premiere. It was a 5-year agreement, not 10, reflecting Skydance's desire for a shorter commitment. The streaming component, a separate deal between South Park Digital Studios and Paramount Plus, was valued at approximately $1.5 billion, or $300 million per year. Paramount Plus became the exclusive global streaming home for South Park, with all 26 existing seasons migrating to the platform. New episodes would air on Comedy Central and stream on Paramount Plus the following day. The HBO Max deal expired, and South Park left that platform on August 5th, 2025. The total value of the deals Parker and Stone have signed over the course of their career with Comedy Central, Viacom, and Paramount is difficult to calculate precisely, but it exceeds $3 billion by a considerable margin. From a construction paper short that was never meant to be seen by more than 100 people to a multi-billion-dollar franchise that spans television, streaming, film, video games, and live entertainment. The 1997 contract clause that Kevin Morris inserted, the one that nobody thought was worth anything, has generated more wealth than most television networks. And throughout all of it, the the fundamental tension has remained unchanged. Parker and Stone want to say whatever they want to say, however they want to say it. The corporation that distributes their work wants to manage risk, protect revenue, and avoid the consequences of offending powerful constituencies. Sometimes these interests align. Most of the time, they coexist in uneasy equilibrium, and occasionally they collide. And when they collide, the results define not just the show, but the boundaries of creative expression in American media. Season 27 itself provided a fitting illustration of the evolving relationship. The season premiered with strong ratings, and the second episode, which featured satirical depictions of Kristi Noem and J.D. Vance, drew the highest viewership for a South Park episode since 2018, with over 6 million viewers across platforms. The show remained, nearly 3 decades after its premiere, one of the most watched programs on cable television. But the viewing landscape had changed fundamentally. Comedy Central itself had diminished as a cultural force. The network that South Park had built was by 2025 a shadow of its former self. Other programming had come and gone. The Daily Show had changed hosts multiple times. Chappelle's Show had departed. The Colbert Report had ended. The audience for cable television had contracted as streaming platforms absorbed more and more viewership. Comedy Central was still South Park's broadcast home, but the real audience, the audience that mattered commercially, was on Paramount+. This is the gap at its most expansive. The distance between what Comedy Central was in 1997 and what it became by 2025 is the distance between a network that needed South Park to survive and a network that existed, in large part, as a legacy platform for South Park to air on before moving to streaming. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had inverted and then dissolved into something more complex. A three-way relationship between the creators, the broadcast network, and the streaming platform, all owned by the same parent company, all competing for the same revenue, all dependent on the same two men from Colorado. The show had also evolved in how it dealt with its own network. In Season 23, the episode Basic Cable, which aired on December 4th, 2019, directly satirized the tension between cable television and streaming media. The episode features a cable technician whose job is being rendered obsolete by the proliferation of streaming services, and it ends with a closing title card offering the streaming rights to a fictional show within the show, complete with an actual phone number that viewers could call to reach Trey Parker. The episode was, in essence, South Park's eulogy for the medium that had given it life. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this reresis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is another dimension to the South Park and Comedy Central relationship that deserves attention, and it has to do with the production process itself. South Park is made differently from every other animated show on television. Most animated series require months of production time per episode. The Simpsons, Family Guy, and similar shows operate on production schedules that span 6 to 9 months from concept to completion. South Park produces each episode in approximately 6 days. This is not an exaggeration or a simplification. A 2011 documentary called 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford, followed the production of a single episode, Human Centipede, from initial concept on Thursday to broadcast the following Wednesday. The documentary reveals a creative process that is closer to journalism than to traditional animation. Parker and Stone begin each episode with current events, topical references, and cultural observations, and they construct the script, animation, voice recording, and editing in a continuous, sleepless sprint that culminates in the completed episode being delivered to Comedy Central just hours before airtime. This production method has several implications for the show's relationship with its network. First, it means that Comedy Central has almost no time to review episodes before they air. The network receives the final product so close to broadcast that substantive changes are often impractical. This is not an accident. Parker and Stone have spoken about the 6-day process as a creative choice, a way of keeping the show fresh and topical, but it is also a strategic choice. The compressed timeline functions as a form of creative protection. The network cannot censor what it has not had time to review. Second, the 6-day process means that South Park can respond to current events with a speed that no other scripted show can match. When a news story breaks on a Monday, South Park can air an episode about it on Wednesday. This responsiveness has become one of the show's defining characteristics, and it has reinforced its cultural relevance across decades of changing media consumption. Third, the process has created a dependency that runs both ways. Comedy Central depends on Parker and Stone to deliver an episode every week, but Parker and Stone depend on the infrastructure that Comedy Central provides: the broadcast slot, the technical facilities, the distribution network that ensures the episode reaches millions of viewers the moment it is complete. The 6-day process is a high-wire act that requires absolute trust between the creative team and the network, even when that trust is strained by disagreements over content. The production process also reveals something about the psychological dynamic of the relationship. Parker has spoken openly about the anxiety that accompanies each episode's completion. He has described a weekly ritual in which, every Tuesday, Matt Stone and producer Ann Garofino must talk him down from the belief that the current episode is terrible and should not be shown to anyone. This pattern, the weekly crisis of confidence, followed by the weekly delivery of a finished episode, has persisted for decades. It is the emotional engine of the show's production, and it operates entirely within the framework of the Comedy Central broadcast schedule. The deadline is the discipline. Without the network demanding a finished product every Wednesday, the show might not exist at all. This is the behavioral read applied to the creative process itself. Parker says the show is terrible. Parker delivers the show anyway. The behavior, not the words, reveals the truth. The complaints about quality are not genuine assessments. They are a psychological mechanism, a way of managing the pressure of producing 20+ minutes of scripted animated content every 6 days for over a quarter century. And the network, by maintaining the deadline, by insisting on the weekly delivery, provides the structure within which that mechanism operates. There is a broader philosophical question embedded in the South Park and Comedy Central relationship, and it has to do with the nature of creative freedom itself. Parker and Stone are often described as creators who have total creative freedom. They can say whatever they want. They can mock anyone they choose. They can push boundaries that other shows would never approach. And this is true, up to a point. But total creative freedom is a myth. It does not exist in commercial media. Every creative work that is distributed through a corporate infrastructure is subject to the constraints of that infrastructure. The constraints may be explicit, as in the case of standards and practices, guidelines that prohibit certain language or imagery. They may be implicit, as in the case of corporate relationships that make certain targets more risky to satirize than others. Or they may be existential, as in the case of death threats that make certain content too dangerous to air. Parker and Stone have more creative freedom than almost any other creators in television, but they do not have absolute creative freedom. They cannot show Muhammad. They could not stop Comedy Central from censoring episode 201. They could not prevent the Scientology episode from being pulled. They could not override the corporate calculus that in each of these cases determined that the risk of airing the content outweighed the benefit. What they have, instead, is negotiated freedom. Freedom that exists within the boundaries of a commercial relationship. Boundaries that shift over time as the leverage of each party changes, as external pressures wax and wane, as the financial stakes grow larger or smaller. The story of South Park and Comedy Central is the story of that negotiation, conducted over 3 decades, across hundreds of episodes, through billions of dollars in revenue, under the shadow of death threats and lawsuits and corporate mergers, and the slow, relentless transformation of the American media landscape. And the negotiation continues. Season 27 airs on Comedy Central, streams on Paramount Plus, generates revenue that flows through contracts drafted by lawyers who have spent decades mapping the terrain of this relationship. Parker and Stone are older now. They have children. They have wealth beyond anything they could have imagined when they were cutting construction paper with scissors and filming it frame by frame. But they still make the show in 6 days. They still push against the boundaries. They still say the things that other people will not say. And they still deal with the consequences, corporate and personal, of saying them. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves exploration before we arrive at the conclusion, and it concerns the way South Park has used its own show to comment on its relationship with Comedy Central. This is not a subtle thread. It is, in fact, one of the most persistent and overt themes in the show's history. The earliest and most direct example is the Cartoon Wars 2-parter itself, which dramatizes the censorship battle in real time, with the creators writing scenes about their network refusing to air scenes. But there are many other examples. In the season 23 episode Basic Cable, the show directly addresses the tension between cable television and streaming. In the Streaming Wars specials, the show lampoons its own streaming platform. In countless episodes across the show's run, Parker and Stone have embedded commentary about the entertainment industry, about corporate decision-making, about the compromises that creators make when they work within institutional structures. This practice of using the show to critique the show's own institutional context is itself a form of negotiation. When Parker and Stone make an episode that satirizes Comedy Central or Paramount, they are not just expressing frustration. They are asserting power. They are demonstrating that the network cannot control the narrative because the narrative is being produced by the very people the network is trying to control. The show becomes a weapon in the negotiation, a public forum in which the creator's perspective is broadcast to millions of viewers, while the network's perspective is confined to press statements and legal filings. This dynamic has no parallel in television history. No other show has sustained a decades-long, public, frequently hostile commentary on its own network while continuing to air on that network. No other creators have turned their employer into a recurring antagonist in their own work while remaining under contract to that employer. The relationship between South Park and Comedy Central is not just a business relationship. It is a creative relationship, one in which the business conflicts are themselves raw material for the show's content, and the show's content is itself a factor in the business conflicts. Before we move on, if you are enjoying this rearesis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The question that remains is whether the relationship between South Park and Comedy Central has been, on balance, beneficial or harmful to the show's creative output. And the answer, like most answers involving complex relationships, is both. Comedy Central gave South Park a home when no other network would have it. Fox said no to Talking Pooh. MTV might have sanitized it. Comedy Central said yes, and in saying yes, it enabled the creation of one of the most influential works of satire in American cultural history. That yes was not a principled stand. It was not a bold artistic vision. It was a desperate gamble by a struggling network that had no better options. But the motivation does not diminish the result. Whatever Comedy Central's reasons for saying yes, the yes itself was the most important single decision in the network's history, and one of the most important decisions in the history of American television. Without that, yes, there is no South Park. Without South Park, there is no Comedy Central as we know it. The network provided the platform, the infrastructure, the distribution, and the audience that allowed Parker and Stone to reach millions of viewers every week. Without Comedy Central, South Park does not exist. That is a simple, undeniable fact. But Comedy Central also constrained South Park. It censored the Muhammad episodes. It pulled the Scientology episode. It delayed the Cartoon Wars arc. It imposed standards and practices, guidelines that shaped what the show could and could not say. It made business decisions that prioritized corporate interests over creative expression. And in at least one case, the censorship of episode 201, it silenced the very message that the show was trying to deliver about the dangers of silencing messages. The tension between these two realities, the enabling and the constraining, is not a flaw in the relationship. It is the relationship. It is the engine that has driven the show for nearly 30 years. Parker and Stone create at their best when they have something to push against. And Comedy Central has been the most consistent, most present, most consequential thing they have pushed against. The network is not just the platform for the show. It is, in a sense, a character in the show, an invisible antagonist whose presence shapes every creative decision, even when it is not explicitly referenced. South Park has always been a show about power, about who has it, who does not, and what happens when the people who do not have it refuse to accept that fact. And the relationship with Comedy Central is the show's most personal, most sustained, most intimate exploration of that theme. Every censorship battle is a power struggle. Every contract negotiation is a power struggle. Every corporate decision to suppress or permit content is an assertion of power by one party and a response by another. In 1997, Comedy Central had the power. It was the only network willing to air the show. Parker and Stone needed it more than it needed them. By 2025, that dynamic had reversed so completely that Paramount was willing to pay $1.5 billion to keep the show on its platform, while Parker and Stone were fielding offers from Netflix and Warner Brothers Discovery. The two men who had walked into Comedy Central's offices with a construction paper short and a dream about talking poo now had the leverage to dictate terms to one of the largest media conglomerates in the world. And yet the show still airs on Comedy Central. Season 27 premiered on the same network that aired the pilot episode 28 years earlier. The relationship has survived censorship, lawsuits, death threats, corporate mergers, the streaming revolution, the decline of cable television, and the fundamental transformation of the American media landscape. It has survived because both parties need each other, even if the nature of that need has changed. Comedy Central needs South Park because it is, in 2025, one of the only reasons anyone still watches Comedy Central. And Parker and Stone need Comedy Central because it is, after all this time, home. There is a specific quality to the South Park and Comedy Central relationship that distinguishes it from every other creator network relationship in television history, and it is this. Parker and Stone have never left. They have never taken the show to another network. They have never rebooted it, reimagined it, or handed it off to other creators. They have been making the same show on the same network with the same characters for nearly 3 decades. In an industry defined by churn, by the constant cycle of development and cancellation, of new shows replacing old ones, South Park endures. It is the longest-running scripted show in cable television history, and it has spent every one of those years on the same network. This longevity is not an accident. It is the product of the specific, peculiar, adversarial, codependent relationship between the creators and the network. Parker and Stone stay because Comedy Central, for all its interventions and constraints, gives them something that no other network could. It gives them a canvas, a weekly, half-hour canvas on which they can paint whatever they want within the negotiated boundaries of the relationship and know that it will be seen by millions of people. The freedom is not absolute. The canvas is not unlimited, but it is theirs, and it has been theirs for longer than most marriages last. And Comedy Central stays because South Park is, and has always been, the most valuable asset the network has ever possessed. It is the show that built the network, that defined the network, that gave the network its identity. To lose South Park would be to lose the last remaining reason for Comedy Central to exist as a distinct entity within the Paramount corporate structure. The network and the show are, at this point, indistinguishable. Each is defined by the other. The South Park and Comedy Central relationship has been a laboratory for the entertainment industry. Every innovation, every conflict, every compromise has been observed and studied by other creators, other networks, other lawyers. The lesson of the 1997 clause is now taught in entertainment law courses. The lesson of the Muhammad censorship is discussed in journalism and media ethics classrooms. The lesson of the streaming wars, both the specials and the real corporate battles, is rearized in business schools. South Park and Comedy Central did not just make television. They made the framework within which television is understood. The relationship between South Park and Comedy Central is, in the end, a love story, not a romantic love story. A complicated, combative, frequently dysfunctional love story between two entities that cannot live without each other and cannot always live with each other. It is a story about what happens when creative ambition meets corporate caution, when artistic freedom meets institutional fear, when the desire to say everything collides with the need to control what is said. The silence at the end of episode 201 is still there. Kyle's speech is still bleeped. The 5 banned episodes are still banned. The uncensored version of the show's 200th episode remains one of television's most significant pieces of lost media. These silences are part of the relationship. They are the scars left by the moments when the tension between creator and network became too great to be resolved through negotiation, when the corporate imperative to manage risk overwhelmed the creative imperative to speak freely. But the show continues. Every 6 days, Trey Parker and Matt Stone sit down in their studio in Los Angeles and begin making a new episode of South Park. They write it, voice it, animate it, edit it, and deliver it to Comedy Central just hours before it airs. And every Wednesday, the episode goes out into the world, carrying with it all the tension, all the history, all the accumulated weight of 3 decades of creative struggle, and it makes people laugh. That is not nothing. In a media landscape defined by corporate consolidation, by the retreat from controversy, by the increasing reluctance of networks and platforms to air content that might provoke backlash, South Park endures. It endures because Parker and Stone refuse to stop making it, and because Comedy Central, or Paramount, or whatever the corporate parent is called this year, refuses to stop airing it. The relationship is messy, contentious, occasionally ugly, and absolutely essential. Without the tension, without the push and pull, without the constant negotiation between freedom and constraint, the show would not be the show it is. It would be something else. Something safer, something less interesting, something less necessary. And so the show continues. The construction paper characters continue to swear and fight and say the things that nobody else will say. The network continues to broadcast them, sometimes with bleeps, sometimes without, sometimes with title cards announcing what it has refused to show. And somewhere in the space between what is said and what is silenced, between what is permitted and what is forbidden, South Park lives. That is the story. Not a story of heroes and villains, not a story of good creators and bad corporations. A story of a relationship. The longest, strangest, most consequential relationship in the history of American television. A show that built a network that tried to control a show. And both of them, somehow, still standing, still fighting, still making television that matters. Even when parts of it are bleeped, even when episodes are banned, even when the speech at the end is lost. And if you step back far enough, if you look at the entire arc of this relationship, from the construction paper short in 1992 to the $1.5 billion deal in 2025, what emerges is something that feels almost like a natural law. Creative energy seeks freedom. Institutional energy seeks control. When these two forces meet, they produce friction, and that friction produces heat, and that heat can either forge something remarkable or burn everything down. In the case of South Park and Comedy Central, it has done both. It has forged one of the most remarkable creative works in American culture. A show that has shaped how an entire generation thinks about politics, religion, celebrity, and the nature of offense itself. And it has also produced casualties, banned episodes, censored speeches, departed cast members, corporate lawsuits, and the permanent suppression of content that the show's creators wanted the world to see. The balance between creation and suppression, between what the show has given us and what has been taken away, is not one that can be easily measured. The show exists. The banned episodes do not exist, not in any officially accessible form. The uncensored speech from episode 201 does not exist. The original version of Cartoon Wars Part 2, with Muhammad visible on screen, does not exist. These absences are part of the show's legacy, just as much as the episodes that survive. They are the shadows cast by the relationship. The dark spaces where creative ambition met corporate fear and corporate fear won. But the light is there too. Hundreds of episodes, decades of commentary, millions of laughs, a body of work that has made people think, made people uncomfortable, made people angry, and made people laugh, often all at the same time. That body of work exists because two men from Colorado refused to stop making it, and because a cable network, for all its flaws, for all its moments of cowardice and corporate calculation, refused to stop airing it. The partnership is imperfect. It has always been imperfect. It will always be imperfect. But perfection was never the point. The point was the work. The point was making the show, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, and putting it out into the world, and letting the world decide what to do with it. The silence at the end of episode 201 is still there. It will probably always be there. But around that silence, the show continues. The characters continue to talk. The creators continue to create. The network continues to broadcast. And somewhere in the space between what is said and what remains unsaid, between what is permitted and what is forbidden, between the creative impulse and the corporate response, South Park lives on. It has outlasted the executives who tried to censor it, the organizations that tried to suppress it, the critics who predicted its demise, and the cultural forces that would have preferred it never existed. It persists, stubbornly, defiantly, profanely, for the same reason it has always persisted, because Trey Parker and Matt Stone have something to say, and they have not yet finished saying it. The silence at the end of episode 201 is still there, and it is still saying something. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next. Actually, hold on. Before we get to that final line, there is one more thing that needs to be said. Because the relationship between South Park and Comedy Central is not just a historical artifact. It is a living, evolving, ongoing negotiation that will continue to shape the show and the network for years to come. The 5-year deal signed in 2025 expires in 2030. When it does, Parker and Stone will be in their early 60s. Comedy Central will be approaching its 40th anniversary. The streaming landscape will have evolved in ways that nobody can predict. And the question that has defined this relationship since 1997, who needs whom more, will be asked again. And the answer, as it has always been, will depend on the circumstances of the moment, on the leverage each party can bring to bear, on the threats and opportunities that exist in the market, and on the fundamental, irreducible fact that South Park is made by two people who cannot be replaced and distributed by a network that can. There is also the question of legacy. When South Park eventually ends, and it will end, whether in 5 years or 10 or 20, the relationship with Comedy Central will be one of the central narratives of the show's history. It will be studied, rearized, debated, and mythologized. Scholars will write papers about the Muhammad censorship. Business students will build case studies around the 1997 contract clause. Media critics will debate whether the censorship harmed or helped the show's artistic legacy. And the answer to all of these questions will be, as it always is with South Park, complicated. Because the show is not a simple thing. It is not a hero's journey or a cautionary tale or a straightforward narrative of creative triumph over corporate oppression. It is all of those things, and none of those things. It is a construction paper cartoon about 4 children in a small town in Colorado, made by 2 men who have been fighting with their network for nearly 30 years. And it is also a multi-billion-dollar franchise, a cultural institution, a political lightning rod, and one of the most important works of satire in the history of American art. It contains multitudes, and its relationship with Comedy Central contains multitudes too. The network gave the show a home. The network censored the show. The network made the show possible. The network made the show impossible in specific instances, on specific topics, at specific moments when the fear of consequences outweighed the commitment to creative freedom. The network paid for the show. The show paid for the network. And somewhere in the tangled web of contracts, clauses, lawsuits, and negotiations that bind them together, 2 men from Colorado continue to make something that matters. They make it in 6 days. They make it with scissors and computers and construction paper and a stubbornness that has outlasted every executive, every corporate restructuring, and every cultural shift that has tried to stop them. The show continues. The network continues. The relationship continues. And the silence at the end of episode 201, that long, unbroken bleep that erased Kyle's speech about intimidation and fear, continues too. It is the scar that will not heal, the wound that both parties have chosen to leave open, the permanent reminder that the relationship between creation and commerce is never simple, never resolved, and never finished. The silence is still there, and it is still saying something. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next.